how many more mobile payments were processed in China last year compared to the US? A is 10 times more, B is 20 times more, C is 40 times more, and D is 50 times more. So I'll give people a few seconds to start answering. Wow, all right. Got a lot of... You guys are pretty close on the mark. So the answer is C, 40 times more. And Tim, it's not just in mobile payments, but by just about any measure of size, China is the leader in financial technology, leapfrogging other countries to be the center of innovation. So you spent many years there building a bank from the ground up in Shanghai. What have you observed as some of the reasons for why this came to be?
So as you said, I had the opportunity to build a bank in Shanghai with Silicon Valley Bank and a Chinese bank. So we did a joint venture over there, and I had the opportunity to build it from scratch. So interfacing with the regulators in both continents was interesting. I think the adoption rate in China is quicker. So I think that's part of the reason that we've seen the companies scale to what you're describing in terms of the volume of payments and other transactions.
And Edith, you also spend a lot of time investing in companies in China. You've spoken about sort of the brokenness of the financial environment in China as a reason for why this innovation has come about. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think to start with, if you want to see the future of fintech, everybody should just visit China. At the same time, as you mentioned, I think let's take 10 years ago, China really is all cash society, mostly because there's no credit score system. Credit card adoption is really, really low, which means that in order to pay, and because you take credit card, everybody just pay in cash. So in some way, mobile came about. And then in combination with mobile, of course, and financials and Tencent WeChat Pay are pretty much the dominant in terms of way of payment today. But I think have a lot to do with because it was just the infrastructure was so broken. It made China as a really perfect breeding ground for a lot of fintech startups because it was just no choice. And if you think about if credit card adoption was really, really well done in China, mobile payment probably wouldn't take off.
Right, and Ant Financial's grown to be so much more than just payments. They span insurance, lending, they have their own credit scoring system, asset management. It oversees the world's largest money market fund. So given that you have these giants, I mean, how much room is there for new innovation when you're looking for startups?
Well, I think that, obviously I look at a lot of early stage startup. I think Robin also invest in awesome companies. Because I focus on early stage, I think that it is really, really hard to beat the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent because they have so much data. If we think about it, right, AI, robotics, anything that you just need a lot of resources. Of course, there's interesting facial recognition companies like SenseTime and Face++, sort of to help with a lot of like processing and facial recognition. That is really, really cool. But that's why I actually am very bullish on blockchain. Even though it's a little bit sensitive in China, blockchain is the one area that I believe that even you're not the big guys, don't have a lot of data or money, it's still possible to win.
And we'll get back to that data point later. Robin, you focus on a lot of consumer tech companies in the US, and in China, in many ways, it's much more convenient to be a consumer. You don't have to take cash anywhere. So what do you think are some of the learnings that US companies can take from what Tencent and Alibaba have done with finance in China?
Yeah, I think what Edith talked about earlier in terms of the adoption, China really did leapfrog, right? In the same way as they leapfrogged to mobile from PC, where US had to go through that, and US has to go through cash to debit cards and credit cards, China leaped through that. Although credit card penetration is really low, debit card penetration is actually really high in China. And so that coupled with the fact that China was always a government centrally controlled economy, the government actually focused a lot more on state-owned enterprises, and a lot of the banks and infrastructure were built to serve those clients. And so a lot of the e-commerce companies, emerging retail, and consumers just did not get that benefit, and so we're underserved, which was why that wave really came in. And I think being that they were, China was always like an investment first economy, and now becoming a consumption first economy has a big shift, as opposed to US, where we're used to seeing a lot of consumption. We're just starting to see that really take off as the middle class is rising in China. And so what we're seeing is, how did these companies like Alipay, Tencent Pay, like WeChat Pay, how did they capture accounts outside of their own market?
Right.
And so when we look at companies, we're starting to see there's already like 270 million accounts outside of China for these services.
Right.
Taking, like going after Chinese outbound consumers.
And Tim, fintech companies in China are so much more powerful than they are in the US, and they're really disintermediating the banks much more than they are here. What is the relationship of the fintechs with the traditional banks in China?
So I would actually argue that the fintechs have all but completely taken the consumer away from banks in China. And we've seen with Tencent and with Ali and Financial, Tencent has also its own bank now, WeBank, which is a very, very active consumer bank. And I think that those platforms have at this point won the war of the consumer. So the commercial banks are still focused upstream, right, from the very largest companies on down. And then when you get to the sort of SME space, that's where there's some overlap still.
And you've since moved from Shanghai to New York very recently. Do you see that type of disintermediation happening here in the US?
There's certainly some of the same disintermediation. I don't think it's as rampant at this point as it is in China. As you heard here, the convenience of Ali and of WeChat literally created the market for mobile payments in China and replaced the banks. In the US, because of the infrastructure that is here, those new entrants, due to a number of different things, privacy laws and infrastructure and a number of other aspects of their effort, they're a little bit slower to the competition, and I don't think it's going to be quite as widespread.
I actually want to add to that too, and what I found like so interesting about what WeChat and Alipay have done is that they actually make it so easy for the consumer to transfer money into those accounts, right, from their debit cards, and so that they hold these funds as escrow. But the actual friction comes when they take a percentage of you transferring back to your bank account. And so because of that, people end up leaving bigger and bigger wallets in these places so that they don't incur fees and just use it for every single aspect of their life, from taxi booking to restaurant bookings, right, to like even food and even peer-to-peer.
Yeah, and what Robin just said triggered me to, for WeChat Pay when it first started, it was a brilliant campaign, a sending red pocket for Chinese New Year. And it was purely just peer-to-peer, and obviously they don't charge any fees, but it really sort of start the habit. So it's similar to Venmo, right? And then they build in the merchant side and the credit side of the business on top of this habit that's just so easy that happened on messaging app.
And can Alibaba or Tencent replicate that success outside of China? We've seen them make a lot of investments in Southeast Asia. They have some users in the US, but mostly Chinese tourists who are traveling abroad, and there have been struggles as well. And Financial's deal for MoneyGram here was blocked. So what do you see as the future of that expansion?
I think that Southeast Asia is a really exciting, Southeast Asia and India. You start to see both Alibaba and Tencent is getting more and more active in Southeast Asia. But having said that, I think that payment is one of those things as a combination, is very cultural, plus regulatory, plus financial. There's a lot of challenges. So I actually created a report released in January called China Internet Report. As part of it, you look at a BAT. If they don't build it themselves, they will invest and acquire, right? So you started to see a lot of these M&A activities. And I believe Alibaba invested in Paytm in India, and I think there are more and more to come.
And I actually think that adoption is very exciting, because in the US, in China right now, the fintech adoption is about 70 mobile payments, 70 something plus %. in the actual economy. In India, that's next, which is about 50-something%, followed by UK, which is 40, and US is still low 30s, if not even 30.
Right, on the earlier panel, we had 25%. So, and it's only expected to grow incrementally over the next few years.
I think they start with that investment, as has been described here. So I actually just noticed this week that they invested $180 million in a Brazilian fintech startup. This is Tencent, and they invested $175 million in a Philippines fintech startup to compete with a fintech startup that Ant has already invested in, Ali.
Right, and in terms of, these companies aren't just leaders in financial services, they've built these super apps. How did the regulatory system environment in China aid that growth?
So from my perspective, the regulatory environment in China has been relatively hands-off in the early development of these companies. I think if you look specifically at privacy laws, for example, I think what Ali and Tencent accomplished would have been much more challenging here, especially as they transition into banks using the data that they've gathered on their platforms.
Do you think we've reported that there's an impending new law that will put stricter regulatory oversight over Ant Financial since it's deemed to be a systemic risk to the Chinese economy? Do you think that could hamper its growth or be a sign that it may struggle to continue to grow?
I would not bet against it. I would not bet against Ali, I guess I should say. I think that there will be efforts to contain, as you're describing, but I do think that both Tencent and Ali will continue to dominate and show the kind of growth that they've shown.
And Edith, there are mounting security concerns around the world when it comes to tech companies. And in China, how much of a risk are data privacy breaches and the perceived ability of the Chinese government to meddle in personal data?
I always have this love-hate relationship, which is, I think one side of me as a Chinese person, I think from a US point of view, it's scary. I was doing this research about the report, and like when you cross jaywalk in Shenzhen, and they can do facial recognition through the security camera, and you will actually get a traffic ticket on WeChat. And it is really,
no escaping.
it is really, really scary in one side. But on a different note, I guess China is a very complicated country, and 1.4 billion now, and there's a lot of security challenges. And I can absolutely understand why Chinese government in some way sort of needed to do that. So that's sort of like sometimes I think personally I struggle with it, and I think as Tim mentioned, because there isn't a whole lot of data privacy, it actually enable a lot of the fintech innovation in some way.
For sure,
I think
it creates efficiencies.
Yeah. So on a different note, it is kind of scary.
Well, on that note, Robin, on the flip side, because they have so much unprecedented access to data, do you think Chinese companies are able to innovate at a different level compared to the US companies that have to deal with a lot more stringent data privacy rules?
Yeah, definitely. And even more so, stringent is Europe, right? And so for us, we definitely are very big on China. And so we continue to invest like half the fund there, and seeing a lot of companies now wanting to go from China outbound, not just serving China itself. And a lot of US companies are replicating those models.
And you were speaking about blockchain earlier as a specific place that you're investing in because those startups in China don't need to have access to the data to be able to develop blockchain innovation. So what are you seeing in that space right now?
We've been focusing on more infrastructure level in terms of the project that we invest, scalability, security, privacy, identity. So a lot of the building blockchain is definitely not for prime time yet. I think the infrastructure of the technology itself still need a lot of improvement. But I think what China is super interesting is that first off, September 4th, Chinese government blocked all the ICO. September 11th, it blocked all the exchanges, crypto exchanges, to operate in China, which I think is great for Robin and myself because we do a lot of cross-border, and we absolutely want to help and support, invest and support some of these awesome Chinese team to come overseas and set up shop.
And Tim, I want to ask you about this national social credit system that the Chinese government has been developing for the past several years, and it's reportedly could lead to bans from travel, schools, hotels, and even dating apps based on all sorts of data that the government is supposedly able to access. So, I mean, what are some of your concerns around this? And are you concerned about the role that fintechs in China will play to help develop this?
So I'm less concerned since I moved to New York. I think what is being described there is codification and a sort of increased transparency to what's kind of already going on. So I think to the extent that the ground rules around a social credit system are laid out, there isn't the same, you can't get a FICO score, there isn't the same access to data centrally like there is in the US. So there needs to be some sort of infrastructure to create that level of uniformity across the country, and I think this is one potential avenue.
And we have just a couple minutes for audience questions, if anybody has any for our wonderful panelists. We have one woman. Oh, there's someone in the back as well, and then we'll come to you. Oh, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you. Baldas from BGD Holdings. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I'm particularly concerned about, not concerned, I'd appreciate your thought on the following point. At the core of Chinese companies' capacity to compete in scale outside of China with respect to technology and data is a security and trust issue. Because fundamentally, what you are seeing play out right now is a set of folks, which is the central government there, which can decide when the switches go on, when they go off, what data they want to have access to, what data they do not want to have access. So how do you see the Chinese competitors, like MoneyGram was an issue. The issue really there was access to privacy and private data of US citizens. How do you see the Chinese competitive infrastructure from the private sector side trying to reconcile and handle these issues? Thank you.
Maybe to recap the question.
So just to make sure we understand it correctly, you're saying how can competitors trying to operate in China sort of reconcile with some of the data privacy concerns?
That would be a very simplistic way of putting it.
Okay. We've got about 30 seconds left, so whoever wants to take the challenge.
It's very, very hard. It's just to start with, the other way around, right? So Roman and I both have a lot of portfolio company. Our American companies sometimes may or may not have some idea to go to China. I say that bluntly, if anything to do with transportation, financial, social, it's just very difficult to, as a non-Chinese player, to want to play well in China. Look at Google, look at Uber. I think at the end of the day, it's not, I mean, regulatory and data obviously is one issue. I think even more important is really about understanding cultural and habits on mobile, plus regulatory, plus there's a lot of things to build a company. And we don't necessarily say all Chinese companies should come to the US either. So it really depends on what you're working on. And fintech, unfortunately, is one of the hardest industry for someone outside to break into China.
Well, thank you for...
Yeah, and I was just gonna say that like a lot of what we look at is also China outbound, not just to US, but maybe to the Middle East, Latin America, right? Africa, they're probably making a huge push there. So definitely there's a lot of other markets that are very big.